Is everyone else sick and tired of any post, anywhere, about anything, from how horrible Sniffy Joe is, to a biscuit recipe, being used by a loony leftist to share their hatred for Donald Trump? Perhaps you can see some hidden message in this post, that has anything to do with Donald Trump. This post was about that idiot Griner, who got caught with pot in Russia. Anyone who knows pot is illegal, and then decides to try and sneak it through an international airport, needs to be in jail, because they're fucking stupid. Anyway. Read it carefully, look at it. Do you see Donald Trump, his name, a picture? I must be missing something. I did post my opinion on this individual. I said, at least she's with her own kind. People dumb enough to get caught with drugs, who hate America. At least she won't have to hear the national anthem or see the stars and stripes where she is. So, there's that. Let me decipher this mess. She was wrong, but look at what all Trump supporters right here in America, and a lot of them want to be allowed to vote for committing a crime and a felony. They should get theirs too. Obviously, referencing January 6th. I of course pointed out that the Looney Left normalized political violence, and it is a bit ironic when they point to one day in January, over 4 years of threats, violence, and just plainly being assholes.
I mean, to even entertain for a moment that this wasn't political theater, that they actually genuinely cared, and were so upset and outraged and shocked by all of this, all the Democrats, all of the media, right? We'd have to completely forget the fact that they had stood by and watched and cheered as Black Lives Matter rioted and attacked federal buildings for months and months on end. I mean, after George Floyd's death, protesters gathered up outside of the White House and then injured 60 Secret Service agents, 11 of whom were so injured that they needed to be hospitalized, and then the media in Congress said it was a peaceful protest, and then laughed at Trump because he went to the bunker. They called him Bunker Boy. Black Lives Matter, by the way, which did these crimes and intimidated the U.S. population and coerced U.S. state senators and congressmen for the explicit purpose of politics, which is the actual definition of terrorism, by the way. The same people.
I posted a challenge. The Trump Unacceptance and Resistance Disorder Challenge. These are the Trump administration accomplishments. 121 accomplishments by President Trump and his cabinet. Here you go. Easy to Google and double check. Checking for yourself is always best. I challenge any progressive Democrat to do the same for Sniffy Joe. List his accomplishments for 50 years in politics. 3 bills to benefit Native people. 1 gave compensation to the Spokane tribe for loss of their lands in the mid-1900s, 1 funded native language programs, and the 3rd gave federal recognition to the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians in Montana. Trump finalized the creation of Space Force as our 6th military branch. Trump signed a law to make cruelty to animals a federal felony, so that animal abusers face tougher consequences. Prior to the violent Antifa protests, violent crime had fallen every year he'd been in office after rising during the 2 years before he was elected. Trump signed a bill making CBD and hemp legal. Trump's EPA gave $100 million to fix the water infrastructure problem in Flint, Michigan. Under Trump's leadership, in 2018 the U.S. surpassed Russia and Saudi Arabia to become the world's largest producer of crude oil. Trump signed a law ending the gag orders on pharmacists that prevented them from sharing money-saving information. Trump signed the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, FOSTA, which included the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, SESTA, which both gave law enforcement and victims new tools to fight sex trafficking. Trump signed a bill to require airports to provide spaces for breastfeeding moms. The 25% lowest paid Americans enjoyed a 4.5% income boost in November 2019, which outpaces a 2.9% gain in earnings for the country's highest-paid workers. Low-wage workers benefited from higher minimum wages and from corporations that increased entry-level pay. Trump signed the biggest wilderness protection and conservation bill in a decade and designated 375,000 acres as protected land. Trump signed the Save Our Seas Act, which funds $10 million per year to clean tons of plastic and garbage from the ocean. He signed a bill allowing some drug imports from Canada so that prescription prices would go down. Trump signed an executive order that forced all healthcare providers to disclose the cost of their services so that Americans could comparison shop and know how much less providers charge insurance companies. When signing that bill, he said no American should be blindsided by bills for medical services they never agreed to in advance. Hospitals will now be required to post their standard charges for services, which include the discounted price a hospital is willing to accept. In the 8 years prior to President Trump's inauguration, prescription drug prices increased by an average of 3.6% per year. Under Trump, drug prices saw year-over-year declines. He created a White House VA hotline to help veterans and principally staffed it with veterans and direct family members of veterans. VA employees were being held accountable for poor performance, with more than 4,000 VA employees removed, demoted, and suspended. Issued an executive order requiring the Secretaries of Defense, Homeland Security, and Veterans Affairs to submit a joint plan to provide veterans access to mental health treatment as they transition to civilian life. Because of a bill signed and championed by Trump, in 2020 most federal employees saw their pay increase by an average of 3.1%, the largest raise in more than 10 years. Trump signed into law up to 12 weeks of paid parental leave for millions of federal workers. The Trump administration provided HIV prevention drugs for free to 200,000 uninsured patients per year for 11 years. All-time record sales during the 2019 holidays. Trump signed an order allowing small businesses to group together when buying insurance to get a better price. President Trump signed the Preventing Maternal Deaths Act that provided funding for states to develop maternal mortality reviews to better understand maternal complications and identify solutions, and largely focused on reducing the higher mortality rates for Black Americans. In 2018, President Trump signed the groundbreaking First Step Act, a criminal justice bill which enacted reforms that make our justice system fairer and help former inmates successfully return to society. The First Step Act's reforms addressed inequities in sentencing laws that disproportionately harmed Black Americans and reformed mandatory minimums that created unfair outcomes. The First Step Act expanded judicial discretion in sentencing of nonviolent crimes. Over 90% of those benefiting from the retroactive sentencing reductions in the First Step Act are Black Americans. The First Step Act provides rehabilitative programs to inmates, helping them successfully rejoin society and not return to crime. Trump increased funding for historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, by more than 14%. Trump signed legislation forgiving Hurricane Katrina debt that threatened HBCUs. New single-family home sales were up 31.6% in October 2019 compared to just 1 year prior. Made HBCUs a priority by creating the position of Executive Director of the White House Initiative on HBCUs. Trump received the Bipartisan Justice Award at a historically Black college for his criminal justice reform accomplishments. The poverty rate fell to a 17-year low of 11.8% under the Trump administration as a result of a jobs-rich environment. Poverty rates for African Americans and Hispanic Americans reached their lowest levels since the U.S. began collecting such data. President Trump signed a bill that created 5 national monuments, expanded several national parks, added 1.3 million acres of wilderness, and permanently reauthorized the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Trump's USDA committed $124 million to rebuild rural water infrastructure. Consumer confidence and small business confidence was at an all-time high. Prior to the COVID shutdown, more than 7 million jobs created since election. More Americans were employed than ever recorded before in our history. More than 400,000 manufacturing jobs created since his election. Trump appointed 5 openly gay ambassadors. Trump ordered Rick Grinnell, his openly gay ambassador to Germany, to lead a global initiative to decriminalize homosexuality across the globe. Through Trump's Anti-Trafficking Coordination Team, AC-Team, initiative, federal law enforcement more than doubled convictions of human traffickers and increased the number of defendants charged by 75% in AC-Team districts. In 2018, the Department of Justice, DOJ, dismantled an organization that was the Internet's leading source of prostitution-related advertisements resulting in sex trafficking. Trump's OMB published new anti-trafficking guidance for government procurement officials to combat human trafficking more effectively. Trump's Immigration and Customs Enforcement's Homeland Security investigations arrested 1,588 criminals associated with human trafficking. Trump's Department of Health and Human Services provided funding to support the National Human Trafficking Hotline to identify perpetrators and give victims the help they need. The hotline identified 16,862 potential human trafficking cases. Trump's DOJ provided grants to organizations that support human trafficking victims, serving nearly 9,000 cases from July 1, 2017, to June 30, 2018. The Department of Homeland Security hired more victim assistance specialists, helping victims get resources and support. President Trump called on Congress to pass school choice legislation so that no child is trapped in a failing school because of his or her zip code. The president signed funding legislation in September 2018 that increased funding for school choice by $42 million. The tax cuts signed into law by President Trump promoted school choice by allowing families to use 529 college savings plans for elementary and secondary education. Under his leadership, ISIS lost most of their territory and was largely dismantled. ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed. Signed the first Perkins CTE reauthorization since 2006, authorizing more than $1 billion for states each year to fund vocational and career education programs. Executive order expanding apprenticeship opportunities for students and workers. Trump issued an executive order prohibiting the U.S. government from discriminating against Christians or punishing expressions of faith. Signed an executive order that allows the government to withhold money from college campuses deemed to be anti-Semitic and who fail to combat anti-Semitism. President Trump ordered a halt to U.S. tax money going to international organizations that fund or perform abortions. Trump imposed sanctions on the socialists in Venezuela, who have killed their citizens. Finalized new trade agreement with South Korea. Made a deal with the European Union to increase U.S. energy exports to Europe. Withdrew the U.S. from the job-killing TPP deal. Secured $250 billion in new trade and investment deals in China and $12 billion in Vietnam. Approved up to $12 billion in aid for farmers affected by unfair trade retaliation. Has had over a dozen U.S. hostages freed, including those Obama could not get freed. Trump signed the Music Modernization Act, the biggest change to copyright law in decades. Trump secured billions that will fund the building of a wall at our southern border. The Trump administration promoted second chance hiring to give former inmates the opportunity to live crime-free lives and find meaningful employment. Trump's DOJ and the Board of Prisons launched a new Ready to Work initiative to help connect employers directly with former prisoners. President Trump's historic tax cut legislation included new Opportunity Zone incentives to promote investment in low-income communities across the country. 8,764 communities across the country were designated as Opportunity Zones. Opportunity Zones were expected to spur $100 billion in long-term private capital investment in economically distressed communities across the country. Trump directed the Education Secretary to end Common Core. Trump signed the 9/11 Victims' Compensation Fund into law. Trump signed measure funding prevention programs for veteran suicide. Companies brought back over $1 trillion from overseas because of the TCJA bill that Trump signed. Manufacturing jobs grew at the fastest rate in more than 30 years. Stock market reached record highs. Median household income hit highest level ever recorded. African American unemployment was at an all-time low. Hispanic American unemployment was at an all-time low. Asian American unemployment was at an all-time low. Women's unemployment rate was at a 65-year low. Youth unemployment was at a 50-year low. Prior to the COVID shutdown, we had the lowest unemployment rate ever recorded. The Pledge to America's workers resulted in employers committing to train more than 4 million Americans. 95% of U.S. manufacturers were optimistic about the future, the highest ever. As a result of the Republican tax bill, small businesses had the lowest top marginal tax rate in more than 80 years. Record number of regulations eliminated that hurt small businesses. Signed welfare reform requiring able-bodied adults who don't have children to work or look for work if they're on welfare. Under Trump, the FDA approved more affordable generic drugs than ever before in history. Reformed Medicare program to stop hospitals from overcharging low-income seniors on their drugs, saving seniors hundreds of millions of dollars. Signed right-to-try legislation allowing terminally ill patients to try experimental treatments that weren't allowed before. Secured $6 billion in new funding to fight the opioid epidemic. Signed VA Choice Act and VA Accountability Act, expanded VA telehealth services, walk-in clinics, and same-day urgent primary and mental health care. U.S. oil production reached all-time high, so we were less dependent on oil from the Middle East. The U.S. was a net natural gas exporter for the first time since 1957. NATO allies increased their defense spending because of his pressure campaign. Withdrew the United States from the job-killing Paris Climate Accord in 2017, and that same year the U.S. still led the world by having the largest reduction in carbon emissions. Had his circuit court judge nominees being confirmed faster than any other new administration. Had his Supreme Court Justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh confirmed. Moved U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. Agreed to a new trade deal with Mexico and Canada that increased jobs here and money coming in. Reached a breakthrough agreement with the EU to increase U.S. exports. Imposed tariffs on China in response to China's forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, and their chronically abusive trade practices, had agreed to a Part 1 trade deal with China. Signed legislation to improve the National Suicide Hotline. Signed the most comprehensive childhood cancer legislation ever into law, which advanced childhood cancer research and improved treatments. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act signed into law by Trump doubled the maximum amount of the child tax credit available to parents and lifted the income limits so more people could claim it. It also created a new tax credit for other dependents. In 2018, President Trump signed into law a $2.4 billion funding increase for the Child Care and Development Fund, providing a total of $8.1 billion to states to fund child care for low-income families. The Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit, CDCTC, signed into law by Trump provided a tax credit equal to 20 to 35% of child care expenses, $3,000 per child and $6,000 per family plus flexible spending accounts, FSAs, allowed you to set aside up to $5,000 in pre-tax money to use for child care. In 2019, President Donald Trump signed the Autism Collaboration, Accountability, Research, Education and Support Act, CARES, into law, which allocated $1.8 billion in funding over the next 5 years to help people with autism spectrum disorder and to help their families. In 2019, President Trump signed into law 2 funding packages providing nearly $19 million in new funding for lupus-specific research and education programs, as well as an additional $41.7 billion in funding for the National Institutes of Health, NIH, the most lupus funding ever. Trump signed the first major anti-robocall law in decades called the Traced Act, Telephone Robocall Abuse Criminal Enforcement and Deterrence. Traced Act extended the period of time the FCC has to catch and punish those who intentionally break telemarketing restrictions. The bill also requires voice service providers to develop a framework to verify calls are legitimate before they reach your phone. U.S. stock market continually hit record highs. Alright Democrats, your turn. Let's hear 'em. Then this is the response from a very angry and racist leftist. One of his brilliant statements was, "We don't care about Biden, just as long as it's not Trump." And then of course, he called Trump and anyone who supports his policies racist. At which time I pointed out that he literally just threw the only thing the Looney Left has, because they have no successful policies. Still on the plantation and doesn't even know it. The victims of the Democratic playing card deck. This group makes up the core of the voting element as far as the Democratic Party goes, and thus helps the most to promote the leftist cause. These are the people who think they've been wrong or disadvantaged, or have been told that they've been wronged or disadvantaged. They're also being told that the opposing parties, Republicans and conservatives, are out to wrong them and disadvantage them even further. These are the things commonly referred to as playing the race/age/gender/class card. This is used very often by liberals, so get ready to hear a lot of it. It works, it is effective, and this second group of people, the victims, falls for it very easily. As a result, they become slaves of the liberal mindset. Look no further than how the Democrats try to scare African Americans into believing that Republicans are holding them down, how the Democrats try to scare middle-class Americans into thinking Republicans are hurting the middle class, and how the Democrats try to scare women into thinking Republicans are against their rights. Democrats also frequently try to scare senior citizens into thinking Republicans want to destroy Social Security. Look at the key words mentioned in these accusations: against, holding down, hurting, destroying. In essence, it is fear-mongering targeted at certain groups of people in society, and it works. These Democrats and leftists attempt to spin the issues into backing up this fear-mongering, and people listen to it. And as a result, this entire second group is formed the victims of the Democratic playing card deck. These people often do not know much about the issues, especially as far as fact and reality goes. What they do think they know, however, is that Republicans and conservatives are completely against them and trying to hold them down, or their issue, in general. They believe the way they do because of the total spin and fear-mongering they hear from Democratic and liberal leaders. They then go out and vote for these said Democrats, and become strong leftists, mostly out of fear and loathing of the other side values instilled into them. Furthermore, they become very likely to start calling conservatives bigots and racists, because of the lies that the liberal left has drilled into their heads. He has since blocked me after I destroyed their God, with one video, Barack Obama.